So there's 3 types of tubing. The main tubing coming off of your coupler is going to be what's called your jumper. So the jumper connects to typically barrier tubing, and then the barrier tubing connects to choker line. These lines are usually made out of different materials. Vinyl is the most common for jumper lines because it's soft, it's flexible, it's easy to maneuver. That's typically connected to barrier tubing, especially in a long draw system. Barrier tubing is very hard, rigid plastic and has a very low resistance. And so you can push beer through here at a great distance with very little resistance. There's also polyethylene tubing, stainless steel tubing, which you're going to find inside of a Jockey box. And then there's also high temperature silicone. So there's different kinds. But what you're going to see mainly is vinyl tubing, especially in temporary setups. There are different colors of vinyl tubing. You'll usually see red or blue or black for the gas side. And then we like clear on the liquid side because you can actually see how clean your lines are. So if you're using a Jockey box or you're using, if you're in a direct draw situation where your kegs are attached inside of a kegerator, if you've got mold growth, you can see it, right? The only time that you would use color tubing outside or out in the field would be to prevent light strike on the beer, and you'll see that in a Jockey box setup. But again, while it's good for preventing light strike, because you're using it over and over and over again, if somebody doesn't clean it, you're going to know right away. So we here at Coldbreak typically just use blue or red tubing for the gas side, and then we always use clear on the beer side just because we like seeing how clean it is. Tubing can be cut, and once you cut it, you can attach all kinds of different fittings to it, typically called tail pieces. So they can be cut. You can cut your tubing to length, attach tail pieces, which go inside of a beer nut, which then uses a beer washer between your connections. And this is what it looks like when all 3 of these are kind of stacked together. And then tubing is labeled by ID and OD, which is internal diameter and outside diameter. Now, depending on where you're shopping, different companies are going to label the product page different ways. And so it can be kind of confusing, especially when you're trying to build a system. So we, especially at Coldbreak here, everything is labeled by the ID. So if we label a tailpiece 5/16, it works with a 5/16 ID tubing. So example would be 5/16 ID, 7/16 OD beverage grade tubing. So if you're buying that type of tubing, you need a 5/16 tailpiece to connect to that tubing. So I do have a piece of vinyl tubing here. So here we have our tailpiece. We have our beer nut, or our hex nut, beer nut, which then pushes onto your tubing. And then in order to attach that tubing to the tailpiece, you're either going to use an Oerlikon clamp, which is like a stepless clamp, which you need a special tool to pinch, and is more of a permanent installation. Or you have you can use a worm clamp, which can be tightened and loosened with a screwdriver. There's 2 types of clamps that you can buy. Oerlikon clamps, one of the brand names is Oerlikon. They're good stepless clamps. They're all sized differently. Like this is a 15.5, and they've got, depending on the size, that number changes, which would match the tubing size here. The other thing that you can do rather than a hex nut is you can need another tailpiece here. Is you can use a wing nut, right? So if you're doing more of a temporary setup, a lot of times you can add wing nuts to the end of your tailpiece rather than using a tool or a crescent wrench to tighten down your nuts here. You can also use a wing nut, which you can hand tighten as well. So we like wing nuts too on a lot of our stuff.